I think we are good to get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Transformers. For those of you who don't know Transformers, Transformers is the unified voice representing the denim industry and its ideas for positive change. We were founded to create a platform to the jeans and denim supply chain and a central point of contact for consumers, brands, NGOs, and the media who want to learn more about ethics and sustainable innovation in the denim industry. This episode is part of our Truth series. Again, for those joining for the first time, this series was born out of a desire to decipher what is credible and what isn't. And it's a series of episodes where we bring in top experts from around the world to investigate the facts and bring the truth to the table. So check out our previous episodes on our website. And today's episode is all about the topic of the day, reducing carbon emissions and stopping global warming. No small subject. And reducing carbon emissions in the denim supply chain and the fashion supply chain and in the world is really a collective goal. And what I mean by that is it only works if everyone does their part. And if one person fails or one entity fails, we all fail. And the reason I open this session with that is because ultimately, what that means is that this is all about relationships and partnerships, which is why we wanted to structure this conversation in this episode today by bringing together different parts of the denim supply chain who represent different perspectives on this issue. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests today. We have, maybe you can just wave as I say your name. We have Crispin Argento, who's the managing director of Sourcery. And Sourcery is a transformative new approach to sourcing and procurement that goes direct to growers. So brands and retailers can buy direct from growers. And so needless to say, through his work with Sourcery, Crispin works with a lot of cotton growers. So that's the perspective that he will be bringing to this conversation today. Alberto Candiani of Candiani Denim. Hello. Candiani is a denim mill operating in Italy for 4 generations already. They've recently launched Coreva, which is a compostable stretch denim. And in addition to being a mill, they are also a cut and sew operation. And then we have, last but not least, we have Jordan Nordarse, who is the creative director of Boyish Jeans, a denim brand focused on selling more sustainable jeans. And he previously worked on denim projects for Reformation. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Annie to share some housekeeping and to explain a little bit how the Q&A is going to work.
Just really quickly before we dive into it, we ask that you put all the questions in the Q&A and not the chat box, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the conversation. We'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. But yeah, as we go, please feel free to ask along the way and just stay tuned until the end, till we come back, and you'll see me on screen to kind of get to the answers to these questions. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Annie. So before we kick off the conversation, we want to make sure that we're starting in the same place and with a shared understanding of some of the key terms that come with conversations about how to reduce carbon emissions. And so to that end, we've prepared a couple of short video clips that explain some of the words that we felt were key words and that get thrown around during these conversations. And we are going to go ahead and play them. But if you have questions or comments about them, please go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to circle back to them. And the same goes for you panelists. If you have something you want to interject or a comment you want to share, please just raise your hand and then we will pass the mic to you. So the first term we're going to be defining today is net zero.
Just cutting emissions isn't enough. To get into that, we need to talk about net zero.
Okay, so big picture. Carbon dioxide emissions are building up in our atmosphere like water filling up a glass. The fuller the atmosphere gets, the hotter the world gets.
So just turn the tap off. Stop emitting greenhouse gases. I said that already.
Yes, that is exactly what we need to do. But unfortunately, there are some carbon dioxide emissions that we just can't get rid of. So we need to cut our carbon emissions as much as we possibly can. And then we need to use some form of carbon dioxide removal, CDR, to suck up that last little bit of emissions that we can't otherwise cut. And this is what we call net zero emissions.
Thank you.
The report makes absolutely clear that we need carbon dioxide removal. It is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. In other words, if stopping global warming is to be achieved.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on that short clip?
What water was he drinking? Where was he?
Good question. I don't know.
Hopefully not in New York.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's. I was just going to say, I think it's as we get into the conversation, it's really important because we really have to think of the term carbon budget and really look at it as though we're doing our own P&L, like a lot of brands have done. They call them environmental P&Ls. And you really look at removals, and removals are your revenue, let's just say, and your emissions are your costs. And in anybody who's run a business, you have your revenue, you have your cost, and what's left over. And the point here for net zero is to get that down to zero effectively. From the way I understand it, is that correct from your perspective, Kim?
I think I would agree. And one of the things that, my perspective, and one of the things that I have also heard, which I think we might come up later in the conversation too, is do we need a global ledger? Because this comes back to being a collective goal. And if, you have some countries who are achieving net zero, or some companies who are achieving net zero, but collectively we aren't, then what's the point? We're not gonna hit our goals. And speaking of goals, that's the perfect segue to the next term, which is the Paris Agreement.
What is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This requires economic and social transformation to face the climate challenges now and moving into the future based on the best available science. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action. By 2020, countries communicate their plans known as nationally determined contributions. Countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. This may include information on adaptation and finance flows. The Paris Agreement also provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Starting in 2024, countries report transparently on actions taken. Collective progress under the Paris Agreement will be assessed through a global stocktake. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans in the next round.
Thank you. Any comments, questions, thoughts on the Paris Agreement? I think that it's actually, I want to move. Oh, Alberto, yes? No? Okay. Then I want to move directly into the next one, which is about 1.5 degrees, because I think these two terms are actually quite connected, which is, okay, we have this framework for what we're going to do, but why is everyone talking about 1.5 degrees specifically?
They want it to be a roadmap for how we get out of this climate mess. The easy answer, stop burning coal, oil, and gas. But how we do that is a totally different question. The summary for policymakers and the full report start in the same place, so we might as well too. How are we managing that whole rising temperatures thing?
Not great, Miriam.
Oh, hey there. That's Climate Adam, a fellow climate scientist and YouTuber. All right, so it isn't great, but we have seen some improvements since the IPCC's 5th assessment report in 2014.
Yeah, well, around the world, we've seen new laws and policies, which mean we've emitted less than we otherwise would have. This has made the worst case scenario, where the world heats up by 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, unlikely.
All right, so progress.
Yup.
Enough progress?
Nope, because emissions are still going up for every major greenhouse gas.
Continuing to use existing fossil fuel infrastructure puts us on a path well above 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. We're already seeing stronger storms and devastating fire seasons with just 1 degree of warming, so keeping things below 1.5 should be our goal.
Well, the report doesn't actually say that.
I know, but it should have.
And for reference, the report that they're referring to in this video is the IPCC report that came out in November of last year. Any thoughts or comments on 1.5 degrees and why that is so critical? Okay, that's okay. The objective here again is really just to ensure alignment and a certain shared starting point before we dig into the conversation. So with that in mind, I want to move to the next term, which is our second to last term, and it's offsetting.
Do you know that checkbox you can tick when booking a flight or ordering a package that promises you can offset all of the carbon that you just emitted, and you're good?
Have you ever wondered whether that's actually legit?
And we're not the only ones who can apparently buy our way out.
Some of the world's largest companies are relying heavily on carbon offsets to reach their ambitious climate pledges.
Apple is going carbon neutral.
Carbon neutral.
That's why, at Shell, our ambition is to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050.
Yep, even fossil fuel companies are vowing to emit net zero carbon soon, in large part thanks to carbon offsets.
Okay, quick recap. Many projects don't offset carbon, and some carbon offsets may also just help big corporations to greenwash. So what should we do?
There has to be an oversight function, a system, an institution that could truly guard against cheating and misrepresentation in the way carbon offset projects are being run.
A lot of the market to date has been oriented around cheaper mitigation, and I think we need to flip that around. Focus on where the investment is needed to bring about transformational change.
Many companies do clearly state that in their net zero strategies, but it's often unclear how many tons of emissions are getting reduced and which get offset.
The major polluting companies are trying to find a way out of taking real action to tackle the climate emergency.
Thank you. Offsetting is a controversial word, a controversial approach. And I'm curious whether Crispin or Alberto or Jordan, you have any quick comments on this video. Yes, Alberto.
It's really well made, and there's a big contradiction when it comes to offsetting. We know that the greenwashing that gets generated because of offsetting opportunities is not very visible. It's not very tangible. And yes, here, I mean, we can really open up a conversation about this. I'm just always very skeptical when I get offered offsetting sort of opportunities. Now, things which have changed, at least in Italy, is that, for instance, energy suppliers, they would come to you and they need to let you offset sort of locally. So they give you more specific opportunities, and you can actually get to see the sources or the availabilities of true renewable energy coming from, I mean, it's becoming traceable. So this is something which is good enough. But again, offsetting allows incredible greenwashing operations.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Alberto said. I think one of the issues with obviously that video is how almost everybody can do it, which is obviously a red flag right there, and it is true. You know, we live in a society where people like to take the easy way out. So if we can find a shortcut, we will take it. And that's what's really the issue. And one of the gentlemen in that video, he said, you know, like how there needs to be a little more regulation. And the regulation needs to happen on the accountability side. Really, it's just if you output carbon, you just got to figure out how to cycle it all back. You know, the oil industry is trying to push everybody's problems to make it the individual's problems, when really a lot of this is coming from the companies. Profits are insane right now on oil. Nobody wants to give that up. No one wants to give up the good life. So that's really what we're fighting is fighting the fact that people are going to be going around us, and there is a silent war, a cold war here happening, and that, you know, we can't just be all jolly good people just saying, hey, we're going to all do good and let's just do it. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, and we're going to get into later in the conversation. One of the questions for you as a representative of a brand in this conversation is also, you know, we'll ask you to elaborate on that because, you know, why didn't you go for offsetting? I think you've already spoken to that a little bit, but then, you know, how else could you approach that? So coming soon. Crispin, you said you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, throughout this conversation, I will attribute carbon accounting to financial accounting, and offsets are equivalent to having a big giant credit card. There's a term that we used when we were kids called the $20,000 millionaire, and it was the person that wanted to present themselves as though they were rich, and they weren't. And it's the same thing. It's offsets just kind of allow you to pretend, and that is they are a critical point, but it's not real, tangible value. It's not taking responsibility. It's not getting the job. It's just, you know, swiping your credit card and getting through the next day and pretending.
Taking responsibility. Yeah, I think that's a key phrase that we're going to come back to again and again in this conversation. The last term we want to talk about before we really dive into things is sequestration.
Carbon atoms are the building blocks of all life on Earth, and the exact same amount of carbon has been on the planet since the day of the dinosaur. So why does it get such a bad rap today for accelerating climate change? It's a matter of balance, and today our carbon cycle is not functioning the way nature intended. Here's how the carbon cycle should work. Animals eat plants, which are made from carbon, and they return it to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide through respiration and elimination. Plants capture this atmospheric carbon dioxide and sunlight to provide themselves with food through a process called photosynthesis. Excess carbon is then stored in the plant biomass or the soil. Storing or sinking carbon is called carbon sequestration. Scientists estimate that the pasture land in the US alone sequesters as much carbon as 88 million vehicles emit in just 1 year on the road. However, when the rate of carbon being emitted is greater than the amount of carbon being sequestered, the cycle becomes overwhelmed.
Thank you. So I think in a way that video on sequestration is the perfect sort of counter to or balancing or to the term offsetting, which we just discussed. Is there anything, Crispin, Jordan, Alberto, that you want to add about sequestration, or do you feel good to go for now? Good to go? All right. So before we get into the meat of this conversation, I want to connect this all back to fashion, because we've had a lot of these big terms, global conversations, and I want to bring it back home. And I want to do that by sharing a quote from an article written by Alden Wicker for Weerd back in November 2021, so not that long ago. And the title of the article, I think, says it all. The title is, "The Fashion Industry Could Reduce Emissions If It Wanted to." And the quote goes like this. In 2019, some of the largest fashion brands in the world put their names on science-based climate targets, saying they would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions 30% by 2030 in order to stay in line with a UN-endorsed pathway to keeping the climate from warming more than 1.5 degrees. Just a couple of years later, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which has over 130 brand members, including Amazon, Gap, H&M, Nike, and Under Armour, upped that target for its members to a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. At COP26 conference in late 2021, 130 companies joined in an announcement that they would reach net zero emissions no later than 2050. The article then goes on to say, according to the World Resources Institute, 96% of a fashion brand's footprint is in its manufacturing supply chain. In other words, it's the factories, and to a lesser extent, farmers who grow cotton and raise sheep for wool and cows for leather, who will have to do the work so that brands can reach these lofty, well-publicized goals. So, and that's the end of the quote. So that is why we are so keen to have this conversation today between Crispin and Alberto, who represent supplier perspectives on this issue, together with Jordan, who's working on the brand level and making sure that the right incentives are in place for his supply chain. So let's talk about carbon emissions and the denim industry. Alberto, which part or parts of making a pair of jeans has the biggest impact on carbon emissions, and do we even know?
Yes, we do know. But again, it's easy to speculate. I mean, we know that, the most important raw material we use is cotton. So it is true, we have to go back to agriculture. And I'm glad we have Crispin here, because there's a lot to talk, especially about regenerative practices and many other things related to cotton growing, for sure. But if I look at my own company, at my own facility, the industrial facility, well, you did mention we're denim makers. So basically we're transforming the fibers into yarns. We're dyeing the yarns, weaving them, finishing them. And yes, we do have a very small cut and sew operation, as much as we have a very small laundry, but that's super small. It's a micro factory type of thing. So that doesn't really count. So the denim operation, the weaving and the spinning in particular, they consume a lot of energy. Here in Italy, we have a funny word that describes companies like mine, and it's energivorous. So we eat lots of energy, and it is something that normally doesn't really get associated with textiles. Normally, the steel companies or heavier sort of industries, you can define them as big energy consumers. Textiles also is, in particular, spinning and weaving. Well, it's actually great to have this conversation today for the simple reason that the energy cost is escalating to a point that, I mean, it's actually even dangerous to produce today. I mean, right now, the more we produce, the more we lose. And this is actually happening. I mean, we're doing great at Candiani. We're overbooked probably. We're going 110% capacity. We just hired 85 people in order to increase spinning and weaving capacity. And the more we produce, the more we lose, because we're not really able to put it on the price. We would have to raise prices by 35%, which is totally unprecedented in our industry, even though we are raising prices. But especially in Europe right now, the situation is not under control. So we have to get smart, and we have to go for what I always define the grandfather of sustainability, which is a very, very simple industrial purpose factor. It's called efficiency. So you just want to become more efficient. And by becoming more efficient, you try to consume less. And you get smart because you don't want to pay those bills. And so you're trying to generate energy in a different way. For instance, we use and consume quite a lot of water in the denim process. So we just want to use water to create energy when it's possible. And this is something which also requires in-house solutions. So solutions which are not really provided by the suppliers. We need to come up with our own solutions. And for instance, we just invented our own turbines, which are actually operated by the water discharge from the dyeing division. We incremented the heat exchangers, I believe you say in English, to a level that really maximizes the efficiency. And today we're looking again seriously into solar, even though I'll just give you a number. I can actually cover 100,000 square meters with solar panels, but that would generate less than 10% of my total need. So when it comes to solar, unfortunately, I'm not trying to say that solar can be a greenwashing operation, but till this very moment, it's been a strong marketing operation and not really an industrial factor yet. But of course, with those costs, we're looking at that once again. Again, spinning and weaving in particular take a lot of energy.
And I know that, I'm not muted, right? I know that one of the other things Candiani is investing a lot in also is the way that you source and what kind of cotton you're using. Can you speak a little bit to that and how that sort of forms part of your approach in terms of thinking about your denim's impact on carbon emissions?
Sure. 3-4 years ago, I had the impression that regenerative was going to become the new big buzzword, but interestingly, I found out there was no real literature around regenerative practices. In the past 3-4 years, it developed in a very interesting way, and we decided as Candiani to join Control Union's Region Agri program for the simple reason we thought that it was actually providing the more accurate literature. Regenerative, and again, Crispin is going to talk about it, I'm quite sure, doesn't necessarily mean organic. Regenerative practices or regenerative grown cotton is there to, again, to maximize efficiency. So we're going back to the same purpose. And in this case, we're maximizing efficiency without interfering or trying not to interfere with biodiversity. So there's a way which is partially holistic, but also very scientific to make cotton growing more efficient through regenerative practices. And yes, we have now started to source regenerative cotton out of Brazil, again, under the Region Agri program and the Region Agri certificate. And we are helping them to expand their program into Europe, even into the United States, because we believe that is a very responsible thing to do. And it is something that the whole industry is now very interested about.
Jordan, I want to turn to you because as a brand, I'm curious, how do you, as a denim brand specifically, how do you guys approach this? And when you're looking at your total supply chain from grower through to when you receive a finished pair of jeans, how do you, do you feel like you have clear oversight as to where the biggest impact is? And also, let's leave it there to start and see where we go.
Yeah. With us, we focus a lot on like life cycle assessments and also like other published reports that come from people doing scientific research to kind of tell us, based on actual data, that what are we doing and what's the impact going to make and what decisions should we make from there. So a lot of what we try to do too is we try to limit the transportation of our supply chain to try to source everything locally, which is also where Alberto was talking about carbon offsets with local ambition behind it, which is really important because, for instance, if you can only create 10% solar power, which is 10% still better than nothing, but it's expensive and it raises the costs. And at the end of the day, if you're the only one doing it, then it doesn't really impact it because then your product has to be more expensive. Customers won't understand the value because it gets diluted by the time it goes from manufacturing all the way back to the actual customer purchasing it from a brand. And this is where the real stress comes from a brand, is because it's price competition. With our company, we try to source locally, and we have a smaller supply that requires based on our demand, versus, say, for instance, some of these larger companies that require a lot more resources. So on our end, we can maybe pick the most premium of materials that have the best reports, but supply wise for bigger companies, they might not have that option. So on our end, we're, because we're more boutique, our impact might be ridiculously lower than a larger brand, but they have to maybe find a better supply chain that requires a little bit more carbon. However, once again, it's the 10% aesthetic. If you're doing 10% better, that's better than right now, where a lot of these big companies are maybe doing 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% if they're lucky. So I think it just comes down to baby steps and trying to figure out that source and the least amount of carbon in your supply chain, and based on transportation and scientific data.
Alberto, if a consumer wanted to know for a specific product exactly what its carbon emissions contribution was at each step of the process, is there any way that they could know that right now?
Not in this very moment. We are working on something. It's software and hardware sort of platform, which is going to be ready next year, maybe in 2 years. I have to be honest with you, because right now I want to monitor for like literally each fabric we develop, and then the transformation of that fabric into a pair of jeans and the wash and all of that really includes too many factors. What we are trying to develop at Candiani, at least, we want to cover our part. So we want to define, the energy consumption for each item we develop, but that is also very much related to the volumes we produce of each single item. And we don't have to forget one very simple thing. Denim is unfortunately the most popular fabric in the world, and always been treated as a commodity or something like that. So it's a volume-based type of fabric. In a way, the less you produce, which became our specialty, at Candiani, we produce in Italy, we're kind of expensive, and, many brands come to us for smaller quantities. And the least you produce of each fabric, the least efficient you are. And so in a way, you are expanding the energy you consume, and probably you make your carbon footprint a little worse. Again, it's not easy for us to quantify it yet. We're working on it, and I think Transformers as a foundation should also develop something which goes in that direction, implementing the garment making and also the washes. But it's going to happen, and it's not only Candiani, and many competitors are trying to do the same thing. Life cycle assessment, in a way, defining the path, and this is obviously also implying the supply chain, in particular the farms.
Crispin, is there anything you want to add to this conversation so far?
There's a lot that was covered. I think the underlying theme here is, Jordan, you touched on it, and Alberto, you did as well, is how do we do it, right? Is we almost know what we need to do. The question becomes, how do we do it? What makes sense from a commercial standpoint, and from a business as a brand level for a supplier, and then of course, for the individual growers, the farmers that are producing the cotton, right? It comes down to a business case, and then what are those necessary and critical investments that we need to address these challenges, and how do we work together to overcome some of those commercial challenges so that we can have better sustainability outcomes. And that, I think, is critical. I would say the answers to that are, we need a real allegiance to real data, primary supplier by supplier, farm by farm data, to be able to drive real impact around GHGs, around water, around other types of impacts, negative impacts that, impact the climate. But we're not there yet. Alberto, you mentioned that, we have hypotheticals, we have LCAs, we have systems that tell a picture, tell a story, but they're often a snapshot in time. But in reality, we need a tool and a system that's a movie reel of impact. And we need to have a realistic approach. I was just doing some research while you guys were talking. Candiani and its facilities sit in Italy. Italy has 50% of its energy load is gas. 20% of it is hydro, because a lot of it is coming from the mountains, coming out of the Alps. Conversely, India, that's a big denim producer, 50% of their energy input is coal. The other 20% is gas, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at, there's no way an Indian supplier can compete with Candiani. There's no way a farmer in Brazil can be benchmarked with a farmer in India or a farmer in Greece or elsewhere in the world. And the same goes for you, Jordan. There's no way that you should be comparing yourself to a multinational. You're making tens of thousands, maybe millions of pairs of jeans, whereas multinationals are making tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pairs of jeans. And it just becomes, we have to have more a truth to materials. It's a phrase that I borrowed from Patagonia, but also an allegiance to data. And data will drive the financial investments that we need to actually move the needle on climate change and other impacts that are critical to not just sustainability, let's forget about sustainability, are critical to the very future of the textile industry needs to happen. That's the truth from my perspective.
So I think
we
in
won't
a
be
way,
able to operate, you know?
this is the perfect segue because, and we're going to come back, Crispin, I think one of the things you just touched on too is, and at Transformers, it's something we talk about a lot as well. You can read all about it in our cotton report last year, but, you know, context matters, you know, and what makes sense in one context may not be what makes sense in another context. And we need to have a conversation about what's a just way to decide what each firm's contribution to these collective goals should be. But we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. But the other thing that I want to push you on is you talked a lot about the business case and the business incentives for this. And I want to ask you, you know, when we talk about the possibilities and what role a company can take in reducing carbon emissions, what incentives do you think there are or aren't for growers to reduce their carbon emissions or to shift into regenerative farming practices that would help sequester more carbon? And if those incentives are not in place, what's your take for what it would take to actually change that?
Well, the incentives for farmers are the same as the incentives in the supply chain for suppliers. There's no difference. Alberto spoke to it. If he could do his wish list of things, he'd have to raise his prices by 32% or whatever it is that you said, or something to that effect. It's the same thing for a lot of growers. Most growers are, I'm not going to say trapped, but they're beholden to a commodity system that does not recognize sustainability attributes as quality that would drive a higher price for that material or that fiber, or mitigate their risk for adopting regenerative practices. Regenerative isn't just a practice adoption. It requires a very focused set of trainings that fundamentally get a grower that doesn't understand maybe a lot of indigenous practices around regenerative agriculture, from biodiversity to soil restoration to no-till is something that you often hear. A lot of farmers, when you say, "Oh, will you no-till?" and they look at you like you're mad, right? You know, so it's the same things. It's that what we're seeing here, I think, whether you're a farmer or you're a supplier like Candiani, or the 20, 50,000 farmers in the world and the 23 million or suppliers, et cetera, is there's just a critical lack of investment to really move the needle. And we have to work together as an industry to move that needle. And that's
Can
what
I push you?
missing.
What do you mean? Can I push you on investment? Because one of the things that and this word and what you think it would take to get that, because one of the things, I had a conversation with a supplier recently, and the conversation was about, okay, access to financing is one part of the story, but even if financing was in place, you still have to somehow link it to payment terms or sourcing practices, because the real financial risk for most of these supply chain actors is material purchasing.
Yes, I think let's just take a supplier. I think it's a little bit more, it's less complex than the financial picture of most farmers, particularly smallholders in places like India, Pakistan, China. But let's take a supplier, right? Suppliers, and maybe Alberto, you can challenge me on this, is you've got, as a business, you have your working capital costs and you have your capital costs, right? You buy equipment that costs millions of dollars and you've got 10, 15 years to pay back that equipment, right? Your working capital cost is your ability to pay your employees, to buy materials, to buy cotton, whatever it might be. And then that together kind of allows you to run your business effectively and efficiently. One is tied to the cost of products. The other is a long-term cost that is built into the core foundations, the assets of the business. And so to make that simpler, we need to be able to tie long-term investments in a new PV array, maybe wind, maybe a new HVAC system, maybe a high efficiency boiler, things like that, with how do I, if I'm going to make those investments as a supplier, how do I qualify for lower cost of working capital so I can recover that? Or how do I create partnerships with my brands and say, look, Candiani, I'm going to buy 1 million units from you for the next 5 years, and we're going to have a baseline price of X dollars per FOB unit. And therefore, you can go to your bank and get that money to invest in some sort of upgrade for your facility or whatever. Right now, this is the dream picture. It's the same thing at a farm. How do we get a farmer to adopt regenerative practices? That requires training. It requires new seeds oftentimes. It requires equipment, expensive equipment to do a no-till type of solution. It requires a financial incentive to take on the risk of doing something different. So I'll digress, but we have to recognize that we make these sustainability projections, but we don't follow them with actual action. Or we take these ambitions, but we don't follow them with action, because we are trapped in the race to the bottom within this industry, but in a broader context.
I want to give Alberto the chance. That's okay. I want to give Alberto the chance to respond and to talk a little bit about within Candiani, how do you approach this, and what's the kind of support that you have needed upstream to achieve some of the things that you have already mentioned you're doing, and also what kind of support are you giving downstream to the people that you are buying from to also work on this goal?
Well, first of all, thank you, Crispin, because I would have said more or less the same things, but from my perspective, like the textile entrepreneur, I'd be terribly boring and negative. You just, you drew a picture which is way nicer, I mean, in a nicer way. But yes, the thing is, we should be working together. I know what I'm saying is, kind of banal, but what Crispin just mentioned. So basically the big brands, right? For instance, those guys that can actually commit to 1 million units, they should finally commit. And they gotta pick their battles, but they gotta stick to it, Unfortunately, loyalty is not really the specialization of our industry, especially the big guys would literally kill you for 10 cents. Okay, so ideally, and again, I believe the big brands are mostly responsible for what we're talking about. Ideally, they should commit to a supplier in first place, of course, not necessarily Candiani, whoever, and walk with the supplier through this path. Because for the supplier, like Candiani, it's kind of easy for us to go back to the farms, if we want, and we really want to connect the industrial apparatus with the agricultural apparatus. I think this is more or less what every single denim maker is trying to do. We did it with the Region Agri program, and again, that is our biggest commitment. We want to help country union to expand it. We want more mills, more competitors to join, because we believe that could really make a big difference. So we want to inspire, we want to share what we've done, because we do believe that, again, the connection between the industrial and agricultural apparatus through transparency, again, not through marketing, but through transparency, can become the new a new sort of language in a way. I'm going to explain to you the concept just by saying that, of course, brands and designers are looking for, novelties and, different aesthetics, a new type of shade or a new type of yarn, but mostly they're now interested in compositions, ingredients, and where those ingredients come from, and how you made that fabric better and better. What's the evolution behind the fabric? Why is the new fabric better than the previous one? So they're basically more interested in the sustainable features instead, the aesthetics or sometimes even the performance sort of qualities. Unfortunately, the very big brands are mostly interested in the storytelling. So if we're now only focusing on the storytelling and we're not going into the details, into the science, into the R&D, into, what is really connecting the industrial and agricultural apparatus, and we just, take like something like regenerative agriculture and make it the new organic cotton, I think nothing is really gonna happen. Nothing.
So I think that's a perfect handoff to Jordan then, because as somebody who is at the brand level in the supply chain and isn't making product directly, I think my question for you is, how do you ensure that your suppliers are incentivized to reduce their carbon emissions?
Oh, my power is no different than a scratch on the surface, because it's everybody's saying it right here. It's numbers. The big players are the ones that guide the market, and the foundation of change comes down to profitability, which I know was talked about earlier about P&Ls being supported by eco initiatives. However, the real issue is we're not fighting people want to change. It's just, once again, it's the action behind it, and it's not. It's physics, and the force that we're trying to push in life, and we can tell this all the way back to the religious dark ages and stuff like that. There's going to be an equal force pushing back, and sometimes that force will push back even harder. And what we're talking about is corporate businesses trying to keep things non-organic, keep things GMO, keep things with pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. They want those things. People selling the seeds, they're selling the chemicals. They're saying you need this, you need that. It's all subsidized. I don't eat meat. I know I do, but I'm just saying, I don't eat. If I'm a vegan and I don't eat meat, I still pay for meat with my taxes, because we are subsidizing people that have power, and they use that power and they lobby. So once again, it's the infrastructure of how people interact in a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective that gets connected into the economics of it all. And we don't want to slow GDP growth, but we want to still produce product. Then we need to think about output. And switching over to organic and regenerative doesn't really increase output efficiency. So there is a lot of things here that we need to figure out, because that's what farmers get scared. They say, well, I have things are working right now. I don't want to take a risk, because if I take a risk, my farm's going to be taken. And that's really the fundamental of change, is the risk of failure.
Yeah,
Crispin, a minute.
Yeah, of course. I'll be very quickly. I think what we're getting to here is that a lot of brands, whether large or small, we've built a system where brands can just go to the grocery store of the global supply chain, and they expect that their products that are on the shelves are there in abundance and are already ready and suited for their needs, right? Because of their practices, their business models, et cetera, right? We look at the Shanes and et cetera of the world, right? They go to that global grocery store as much as the Boyish jeans do of the world. And I think that there needs to be just, again, I go back, it comes down to investment, and it comes down to shared responsibility, shared risk, and shared reward. And, if you look at sustainability in the fashion space, this is not a criticism of a lot of my friends at NGOs, but it's largely driven by philanthropic money. We built Sourcery, and that's not a plug for Sourcery. We will not take any philanthropic money. All of the impact that we do at the farm is driven by commercial drivers, and the cost of sustainability is built into the price of the fiber. And it's very clear to people. And I think that's allowed us to scale so rapidly, because it's just, it's trade. It's not subsidies. It's not philanthropy. It's trade. And the trade is the true cost of what fibers cost, the true cost of what a sustainable pair of jeans cost at a Candiani versus another supplier that's not doing nearly as much as Candiani does for its facilities and for its workers, et cetera. So it comes down to that.
I think that I want to wrap this section up and move on to the next one, because we could go on for a long time on these topics. But I think for me, what I take away too is, when we talk about the right incentives have to be in place at each step of the supply chain. And really what that means is addressing the risk profile of each entity along the way. And, when we're talking about, okay, Boyish is a smaller company, but when we're talking about the big brands, what we really need to be talking about too is how are they addressing that? And what is the distribution of financial risk and reward equitable relative to the margins at each step of the chain? This was supposed to be about possibilities. We ended up talking quite a bit about limits, but we're going to officially talk about limits now. And Alberto, I want to give you the mic. I've heard some suppliers say things like, I have limited financial resources. I could invest in solar panels, but it will only have the collective impact we need it to have if everyone else does it too. So should I be future-proofing my business by investing in solar panels, or should I be future-proofing my business for a world that's 2 or more degrees hotter? And I just want to get your reaction on this and whether this is something that you also debate as you make decisions about what you are or aren't going to invest in.
Yes, I did mention this earlier. I mean, solar in our case wasn't really a solution. It was a very partial solution. Today, I believe we are all expecting technology to develop even further, but we're also expecting incentives from the governments. And this is something else. I mean, especially in a moment like, in a moment like this, with the energy costs being out of control, I think we should finally approach more institutional sort of incentives. Again, I don't want to go back to the previous conversation, but just to give you an example and to make things practical, when it comes to incentives, I mean, together with the Brazilian supplier we picked to develop the regional agri program, we committed to a 3 years program. So we committed to 1,000 tons this year, 2,000 tons next year, 3,000 tons the year after. We consume roughly 14,000 tons a year. And in 3 years, 3,000 tons will be regenerative from that farmer. And yes, the trade, of course, is regulated by traders, but we do correspond a little premium to that guy directly. So this is something my competitors don't want to do. Nobody wants to do that, but you have to accept that sometimes you have to put your hands in your pocket and somehow finance what cannot be otherwise sustained by the common dynamics of our industry, which is pretty much based on try to pay less, try to pay less, try to go cheaper, try to go cheaper. But guess what? When you go cheaper, you go worse. I haven't seen a single yard of denim fabric that costs nothing, which is cleaner than the yard of denim that costs whatever it costs, but comes with innovation. We've been talking a lot about sustainable innovation, and I believe there's no innovation which is not truly sustainable today, and there's no sustainability without innovation. So I see most of the industry a little stuck right now, because to go for true sustainable innovation, you require to invest a lot of money, and those money normally come from your own pockets, and they don't really come from the incentives.
Yeah. I want to ask you a more macro question, Alberto, but also Crispin, I think, and Jordan, of course, you can jump in as well. But one of the things I've heard another supplier say to me recently is, and this was a totally not denim and not in Italy, but what they were saying is, we are being they were also a mill, but they were like, we are being forced to go into energy politics. And that is also something that we don't really know anything about and are not experts in. And so you've shared a little bit just now about at the firm level, but I'm curious your take on sort of at a more macro level. I mean, Crispin mentioned this as well when he gave the breakdown of where power and energy comes from in Italy, but what do we do about that? And connected to that, Crispin, for you, we touched on this already as well, but cotton is grown in all kinds of contexts, in all kinds of ways. And the work that it would take for one grower to reduce its emissions by whatever percent is not the same as for another grower in another context. And so what's sort of like, again, at a macro level, what's a just way to decide what a company's contribution to these collective goals should be? Alberto, I let you go first.
Oh, it's very simple. Again, here the context really matters. We're located in Italy, in Europe. Actually, we're located in a nature reserve, the Parco del Ticino, which happens to be the first institution we refer to when it comes to environmental issues. So we are performing in a very, very delicate environment. And our capability of adaptation basically made us who we are, because the rules and the regulations are super strict. So we have to perform in a very specific way. And I'm proud of my company because we managed, to evolve around such a very specific, inside a very specific environment. So yes, I totally agree with Crispin. It's not even easy to make comparison between denim makers, even garment makers, or farmers. It is pretty much impossible. What you should be able to define is who's cutting corners and who's doing the right thing and who's trying to change things. I believe as Candiani, we're pretty good at trying to change things. We don't always achieve our accomplishments, but we're always trying to change things. As I said, we specialize in innovation, and innovation can only be sustainable today as much as sustainability can only be innovative. Problem is how to showcase, not really to showcase, how to prove those improvements, And we're working on traceability tools. We're working on transparency tools, which cannot be corrupted, in order to make that difference tangible, visible, in order to justify the reason why Candiani is a little more expensive, and not just because we're in Italy, and not just because our labor costs 32%, but why we're doing a good job, how we're doing it. And again, it's about proving things, and most of the industry is not really interested in proving nothing, because they just don't want to show what they do or the way they do it, or even where they do it sometimes. So yes, the context becomes very, very relevant.
Crispin.
Look, I think context, again, if we're going to have a theme, is important, but context is shaped by data at the end of the day, right? We don't have a system in this industry, not let alone most industries, don't have a harmonized system with fixed boundaries, accepted methodologies to collect data in a way that is primary, that allows even a supplier like Candiani to benchmark his performance of all his facilities and then change those performances over time. Now, that does exist in the building space. We have GHG protocol, we have certain things. When it comes to the farm, there's nothing that's like that. And so we need to, again, it's an allegiance to good data, to be able to measure apples to apples versus apples to bananas that we have now. When we have a good data system, then Candiani can measure his own performance against himself, and then he can measure himself against performance of other denim mills in Italy. And then from there, it basically just stops, right? Until we can start to look at, okay, well, what is the Italian government or the EU doing in terms of energy and its mixture of gas, hydro, electric, solar, renewable, whatever it is, right? That is then your responsibility, your sphere of responsibility stops. Your ability to influence stops at that level. It's the same thing with a farmer. A farmer needs to understand how his farm is performing currently, benchmarked against that performance of his own practice adoptions, and then can start to be benchmarked against peers within his regions where everything else is the same. And that's it. And that we get the right context to then be able to make decisions, allocate finance, and solve these problems. But until we have data, we're just pretending.
And also to have these also, I think, questions that are more about justice as well, which is what's a fair way, what's a just way to decide what, different entities' contributions could or should be. I'm conscious of time. Jordan, I want to give each of you a minute to put forward your final call to action, your last plea, your takeaway message. And Jordan, I'll start with you.
Cool. Yeah. So I just wanted to touch on a subject real quick, kind of that goes across a lot of these questions that we had, which really comes down to earlier, because we've had a lot of negative atmospheres, but things are going to change, and that's the one constant, and people just need to accept it. It's difficult because farmers aren't maybe, sometimes some of these farmers aren't as educated. The big farmers are obviously more educated. They have profit. Once again, profit is nice and sweet, so they're having to make that transition into something that's not going to be as profitable. But in this regard, though, there's ways around it. For instance, things are going to get warmer. Agrivoltaics are a great way to subsidize both growing cotton and then have solar panels above it to, offset a little bit of, not necessarily eco, but profitability. So that you can actually, combine, a lower output cotton using regenerative, also utilizing agrivoltaics by producing solar power and selling to the grid. And then also on top of that, as weather changes, as the 1.52 degrees Celsius increases, utilizing regenerative then traps moisture, traps water, helps put water back into aquifers. All those things are going to help in that transition, while also at the same point in time adding power to the grid. This is where it comes to the collaboration atmosphere. And this is where the governments need to come in and be like, all right, we've utilized this practice. This seems like it's going to work. Let's start teaching people. Let's start putting out money out there, low interest loans, long term for these people to learn. And then let's make sure they have to report back. What are your efficiency yields? What are you seeing? Where are your problems? So we can all identify these things and solve them together.
Hey, Alberto, I let you go next. A minute.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, we're living, very negative days. Reason why this whole conversation may sound a little negative, the energy crisis, which is now made worse and worse by the war, and the awareness that things are gonna change now, because once again, we need to adapt to a new environment. And as humans, we got a little lazy. We haven't done really great things in the past few years unless we're challenged by very, very serious shit like the one which is happening. So let's try to make the change. And I know that many people in the industry, they just don't like the change for the reasons that Jordan and Crispin described earlier. But I think we have no choice now. And I think who's not going to participate, who's not going to be part of this change will probably get lost.
Yes, indeed. And Crispin, a minute, but then
Sure.
we'll open up to Q&A.
Yeah, I think very simply, collaboration is the key. Jordan, you spoke to it. Alberto, you did as well. Collaboration or partnership is actually about shared risk and shared reward. And if you go into business with somebody, that's what you go on that journey together with them. And the brand's risk is the supplier's risk, and the supplier's risk is the farmer's risk, and it's also their opportunity. And we need to understand that more to address these critical issues in the supply chain. And I think that takes education and awareness building, but it also requires just requires a new way of working and a new thinking that will be better off for the supply chain and the brands and the farmers in the future. And I know I'm being vague, but it really is about shared risk and shared reward. I can speak to dozens of stories that we've had here at Sourcery around that. One example is, we have a client that makes sheets. They need 60 count yarns. We use the waste of that sheets to make their towels. The cost of the cotton for their towels doesn't cost them a thing because they buy the cotton themselves. Beautiful. Supplier's happy, spinner's happy, everybody's happy. But that's shared risk, shared reward. So that's the type of stuff that I think is powerful when you understand the realities of the trade and you can find the white space to solve problems together.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to open this up to a Q&A and hand over to Annie, but I think that would be my takeaway from this conversation is, we talk about reducing carbon emissions, and you'd think we'd be talking about, I don't know, science or innovation or whatever. And all of those things are certainly part of the conversation. But at the end of the day, I think it all comes back to these financial relationships, and achieving an outcome that is optimal at a systems level or collective level requires addressing that distribution of financial risk and reward. And as Crispin said, I think that is, the word partnership gets thrown around a lot, but really, it means having a vested interest in each other. Your success is my success, and your failure is my failure. And so this conversation really needs to be focused on how do we get those incentives right, so that at a systems level or at a total supply chain level, we have more optimal outcomes. Annie.
Hello. Okay, we've got some good questions from the audience today. I'll start with this first one. It is directed at Alberto, but obviously if both of you, Crispin and Jordan, have anything to add, please jump in. This is from Matthew. So a question for Alberto. Besides being the right thing to do in terms of expanding regenerative cotton into other regions, what were some of the key business considerations to invest in regenerative? How did you convince your customers to follow you with regenerative? And any challenges you can speak to or lessons learned here?
Well, I'll be honest with you, with Matthew in particular. Regenerative will become incredibly successful because, right or wrong, will challenge organic or even replace organic. Now, organic cotton went up price so much that those brands that made a huge story and they can no longer afford it, they're looking for something else. And now they're looking for regenerative. Again, that's not the purpose. That's not my purpose. That's not the reason why we developed those new products. And that's not the reason why I joined the program. I joined it, as always, not because I believe there's demand. There wasn't really demand 2-3 years ago. I was just looking for a different type of offer to create. But today, that different type of offer is really matching this cost increase madness. And again, many people are looking to regenerative because it's more competitive than organic, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Can I add a bit there, just very briefly?
Go for it.
I'm particularly excited about regenerative agriculture. You mentioned early in the conversation, Roberto, it's a buzzword, but it actually is a call to action for empirical data around raw materials. That's what real regenerative is. There's going to be systems out there that are going to usurp the term regenerative, but if you don't have the data, it's just another label. But it levels the playing field between all of the different labels that we have there. There's 26 labels in cotton. Consumers can't navigate through that. And within those labels, there's now additional labels that's creating more confusion. And so, again, data is king here. And that levels the playing field. And that's what regenerative to me is very exciting about.
Great, thanks. And maybe
Jordan, and also, way more scalable than organic. Even regenerative organic is doable, very niche. Regenerative, it's way more scalable than organic. So something which has to be supported.
And on that data note, or sorry, Jordan, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, with regenerative, what people are forgetting about, which goes back to those little videos earlier, is the sequestration of carbon, is that actually soil absorbs more carbon than the trees or the plants. So that's one of the most important things here, is that people think about organic. Organic's actually a very inefficient way of growing because of, they still use till, the practices are still kind of based off of conventional, but trying not to use the chemicals, which then doesn't really necessarily make a lot of sense. So regenerative is great because actually, you don't need as much, fertilizers and a lot of other things, because the soil does all the work naturally. And then it's taking in all that carbon. So these are some of the really important things about regenerative that people don't look at. But once again, I know somebody asked about, obviously, is it difficult for regenerative? transitions, and it is, because once again, you have to take a risk, which means your yield might not be as good while you're figuring this out, because guess what? There's not a lot of research, there's not a lot of help out there to transition to regenerative. So, it's a lot, and a lot of these farmers they're working season to season. They're not, paycheck to paycheck to them. It's not like they have all like the substantial amount of money. And then the farmers that do have the money, they don't want to do it because guess what? They have the money. So why do it if they have the money? And that's what's really difficult is in this process, people think about right now, they look at, they're only looking as far as their shoes. They're not thinking, oh, well, yeah, but maybe in 5 to 10 years, as weather changes, even if I use these conventional methods, that my output's going to be lower. But if I use regenerative and I start now, in 10 years, actually my output will be higher. But once again, it's a risk, and you have to look into the future. And that's, like most people are just worried about what they're going to post on Instagram in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's very true. And on that note, kind of on terms of or what farmers need to do or looking long term, this is a question from Sophie. What do farmers need to invest in specifically to shift to regenerative? Is it seeds for cover crops, something else? Crispin, I know you.
Sure, it's a mixed bag. Again, it's farmer by farmer, right? It's understanding what the practice. It's practices that include everything from no-till to precision agriculture to having the right seeds that are suited for the agroclimate region. It's a number of things. But if I'm gonna just put it as an underlying principle, farmers are willing to do that. They're willing to change. They're not willing to change unless we incentivize them to change, like any of us. I mean, I'm sorry, but if we provide a premium to growers, all growers, not just organic growers, but all growers, and build in a premium and or long-term commitments, they're all fair game. They're like, yeah, we'll try this. We'll try no-till. We'll try permanent beds. We'll try precision agriculture. We'll try bioamendments in place of synthetic fertilizers. We'll try something else, but we have to mitigate their risks. And how we mitigate risks from a business perspective is insurance policies, not literal ones, but insurance policies recover financial loss. We need to be able to build in those systems to say, we're going to try something new, and if we fail, we'll still be okay. That's the main ingredient to regenerative agriculture. Excuse me, that's my office mate, and that's what's missing. The practices, adoption, all that other stuff can come when there's an incentive that's in place.
And a question has actually just come in kind of on top of this one. So thoughts on the NY Fashion Act required disclosures if possible. Is it more harmful than helpful? Yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of this in terms of implementing these practices?
Me?
Anyone?
I think Crispin, go ahead, because I know you're a signatory to one of the letters.
Yeah, look, I think regulation, whether it's in New York or California or the EU, is going to be good because it's going to create incentives from just a legal compliance standpoint. The question becomes, is those laws that are written actually enforceable, and what's that journey to making change? The requirements in the New York Fashion Act, even some of the requirements in the EU legislation, like the UGAR Act in the United States, are not practical. It's not possible to prevent, UGAR-based cotton from getting into the United States. It's physically impossible, and I'm just telling the truth. And so, again, these legislations are there to shape new markets. That's what legislation does, and so I'm looking forward to it if it in fact does pass. But it doesn't solve the issues. It just creates a new set of tools or rules to make business decisions around. And I think that's important long term because it's something that we haven't had in this industry. It's all been voluntary.
And just to add on to that, Alberto and Jordan, you might have an answer to this next question as well, but should incentives instead should push companies to partner with their suppliers?
Definitely. I think that incentives are always great. When you give people things, free is never valued as much as something that you worked hard for.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the nature of the incentives. Now, you got customers, their only incentive is, well, if you achieve $1 million business, give me back 3% bonus. That's the incentive that the industry knows. There's not many people coming to me saying, I'm going to give you 3% more if we co-invest into, the traceability platform so we can track and trace the regenerative cotton you source. In reality, we always wish that brands like Boyish or people like Jordan would be the big guys and not the small guys. But even though he said he's a scratch, he's not a scratch. It really is an influential person, And small brands, trust me, are changing the market because the big brands are looking at brands like Boyish or the small guys, see what they're doing, because they lead again, we're abusing the word sustainability, but yeah, they're leading that sort of specific segment. So people like Jordan can be very, very influential. Of course, they cannot afford to, to provide those incentives, but what they can offer is to be some sort of pilot case. And we've done something together, when we test new R&D sort of product, we do it with the small brands, so we can, and that in a way, that is an incentive. That is an incentive. In a way, it's something to drive the market and to create incentives.
Yeah. I'd just like to add, I think, again, it comes down to collaboration, and a key part of collaboration is shared risk, shared reward. It's also empathy and understanding. And I know these are like high level themes, but this is also true. Whether it's, we create this dichotomy of us versus them, small brand versus big brand, supplier versus brands, suppliers versus farmers, right? But we have to get away from all that. We actually have to step in the shoes of the brands. What keeps you up at night? Of a sourcing or a buying person? What are those things that are your responsibility in your job, and how do I work to make your job easier or you more successful? As a supplier, how do I work to make your job more easy, more successful? As a farmer, how do I work to make your job more easy, more successful, right? And I think that's what that shared understanding that we're missing in the sector, because once we get there, we can invest and do anything. We can go to the moon if we want to as a sector, right? I only use that phrase because it's, the ultimate destination of whatever, at least according to the owner of Twitter. But I think I'm here to stay in on this planet because I love it. It's beautiful. But I think at the end of the day, that's the key here, is we really need collaboration, true understanding, true investment, and true partnership.
Yeah.
And we can tackle anything.
I would jump in and just say too, I think with legislation, as has been reiterated by everyone already, I think legislation is really important and compliance is an incentive. What I wish, at a very sort of big picture level, that we were leveraging legislation to do is to sort of think about due diligence, instead of due diligence being about, or supply chain relationships being about how well or how effectively, from a brand perspective, are you controlling your supply chain or policing your supply chain or making sure that they're behaving in a certain way or not doing certain things. I wish it could be more about how does my behavior impact others, and that we could look at that we could leverage legislation to sort of force that kind of thinking, which is as a business, how do my business operations impact my partners and the people around me? And can I show that nothing that I am doing within my own operations is creating or contributing to the incentive for somebody else to do something that is maybe unethical or counter to sort of collective goals? But that's at a pie, maybe pie in the sky, but that's what I would wish for. Annie, are we out of time, or are there more questions?
There are a couple of questions around LCAs, but I think what we'll do is maybe if our panelists are willing to answer this offline afterwards, maybe give a little insight into LCAs, then we'll do that. So Kim, I'll let you close out the discussion.
Well, I think I just want to thank everyone very much for this conversation. It's been an education, and I feel really privileged to have had the chance to pick your brains and to have this conversation. And for the attendees, the door is always open if you want to connect, if you have follow-up. This is what we're all about. So please don't be shy, reach out to us, and let's take this conversation forward.